Hey guys, it's Libby. Today I'm doing my May wrap-up, and I got through 21 different things in May, so I'm gonna try to keep this as quick as I can. It definitely helped that a lot of those were short for Tour-a-thon, and also I finally finished several things that I've been working on for a couple of months, but also I was just kind of on fire in terms of reading. So I actually had to write this down. I finished one graphic novel, one poetry collection, one play, one audiobook, 3 novels, 2 novellas, and 12 short stories. Let's get it going. First thing I finished was the graphic novel, which is more of a collection of graphic short stories, and it is a reread for me. That is A Contract with God by Will Eisner. You may have heard of Will Eisner because he gave his name to the Eisner Award, which is for comics and or graphic novels. This is a collection of short stories with the same setting. They all take place in the 1930s on a tenement row in the Bronx of New York, and they're kind of like gritty. They're not fun. They deal with like rape and poverty and sexual abuse of children, but they are really good and really clever. My favorite is the first one, A Contract with God, so I think I give this 4 stars. Next was the poetry collection. I read the complete works of John Donne. This looks like a giant book, but only about the first half of it is actual poems. The rest is all notes. I had read some John Donne in high school, and so I was excited to read everything that he did. My favorites were, of course, the songs and sonnets, as well as the Divine Meditations, and I also rather enjoyed the elegies, as well as the epigrams, although I think that the epigrams are not for everyone. They're a very me sort of thing. I read the satires, but I have to admit I did not fully understand them. I should probably say that John Donne was writing in the late 16th and early 17th century, and he covers quite a broad range of topics over his career, starting from like seduction to more conventional romantic stuff to like some self-hating Christianity. And if you want to read some John Donne yourself, I would recommend reading them out loud to yourself while sipping on some sweet liqueur, because getting a little tipsy, I think, definitely improves them. Then I finished the play You Never Can Tell by George Bernard Shaw. This was a holdover. I started reading it for Dewey's 24-hour readathon back in April, and I finally finished it in May. It's about a very modern woman, Mrs. Clarendon, who writes sort of advice books called like 20th century child rearing or 20th century housekeeping sort of things, even though she's still writing them in the 19th century because she is so advanced. And she and her 3 almost grown-up children have returned to England after having spent most of the children's lives in Madeira, and the children do not know who their father is because Mrs. Clarendon fled him. And of course the town that they arrive in happens to be the residence of the father, and of course there is romantic entanglements, and I did not like this as much as some other Shaws. I think it would work better on stage than reading it because there's a very funny waiter who sort of opens doors at exactly the right time, and I think watching that performance would be top-notch. But the story was definitely things that I've seen in other Shaw plays done better, and it wants to say something about domestic abuse, but it doesn't know what it wants to say, and so that part is just kind of ugh. But several moments are still really charming, so I gave it a sort of confused 3 stars. Then I gave myself credit on Goodreads for having finished Sense and Sensibility because I finished the audiobook that I was producing for it. I also played Eleanor in this one because I have a very melancholy voice. So when I was trying to figure out which Austen heroine I was going to be, it was not a very difficult decision to make. You guys probably already know what Sense and Sensibility is about, but I will leave a sample of the audiobook that I worked on at the end of this video if you want to stay and listen to it a bit. The next thing that I read was The Glass of Time by Michael Cox, which I finally finished. This and its predecessor took me a lot longer to get through than I thought that they would. So this is the sequel to The Glass of Time. Sorry, this is The Glass of Time. This is the sequel to The Meaning of Night by Michael Cox. It's set in the 1870s, and as in The Meaning of Night, we are concerned with the possession of a great house in the English countryside. Now, The Meaning of Night is one of my favorite books, mainly because of how interesting the narrator is. Glass of Time is technically, I think, a better constructed book. It's much harder to guess what the mystery is, and setups are more reliably paid off. But I think that the voice of the narrator is just not as good. The narrator of Meaning of Night is a 35-year-old man, and the narrator of The Glass of Time is a 19-year-old girl, and I think Michael Cox had difficulty adopting a female tone. I do give him some leeway, though, because Michael Cox was dying of cancer when he was writing this. So anytime I think a sentence could have been slightly improved or an element of the psychology was not explored as fully as it could have been, I choose to not view this as a flaw, but as an opportunity for me to draw my own conclusions. So I give this book 4 stars. I'm not sure if the fact that The Meaning of Night also exists makes me like this more or less, because, you know, I know what a great writer Michael Cox is capable of being, and he doesn't quite hit it in The Glass of Time, or if the fact that I love Meaning of Night so much is sort of bleeding into The Glass of Time and making me love it more. So don't trust my rating of this book. Just go read The Meaning of Night yourself. You will probably want some more after you finish that. Then the next book I finished was The Wonder by Emma Donoghue, which is actually how you pronounce it, as I have recently confirmed. This is set in the 1860s, jumping back 10 whole years from Glass of Time, and our protagonist is a woman named Lib, who is a nurse. She had been trained in Crimea by Florence Nightingale, and she's now employed in England, and she gets a posting to observe a young girl in Ireland who is reportedly not eating, but also not dying. So Lib's job is basically to sit there and make sure that she doesn't eat. And as I was reading this, I kept feeling like it should be boring, because you're just sitting there watching this girl not do things. But it's actually incredibly fascinating. I'm not sure what Donoghue does, but she really makes you care about, like, what's gonna happen, what is the mystery, is this a supernatural story? And the other thing that sort of pulls you through is Lib's intense disdain for the Irish and Irish things. When Lib first arrives, she is incredibly prejudiced. She thinks that the Irish are superstitious and dirty and dumb, and just so Catholic. Ugh. I did give this book 4 stars rather than 5, and part of that was that I felt like Lib as a character was too developed. Like, I was so interested in the here and now, the stuff that was actually happening in the story, that I didn't really care about Lib's backstory. And so when we had to cut away to hear about that, I was pretty bored by it. So yeah, 4 to 5 stars to The Wonder. And this has also decided me to read some more Emma Donoghue. I had previously only read her collection of short stories called Kissing the Witch, which is great, and you should read it. And a lot of the other stuff that she's written gets really low ratings on Goodreads, like consistently under a 3.5, which is the sort of warning zone for me, except Room. Everyone loves Room, which is one that I'm actually not very interested in. But I enjoyed this so much that I was like, okay, I think the people on Goodreads are just confused. I want to give Life Mask a try. Then came all of the short works that I read for the Tour-a-thon. I made a whole 40-minute video talking about the things that I read for Tour-a-thon, so for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to list off what I read and what star rating I gave it. So I gave 5 stars to All Systems Red, 4 stars to Artificial Condition, The Cold Flame, Intestate, and Mrs. Sorensen and the Sasquatch, 3.5 stars to Reading in Bed and The Unfathomable Sisterhood of Ick, 3 stars to The Cartography of Sudden Death, The Virtual Swallows of Hog Island, Mental Diplopia, and A Rumor of Angels, 2 stars to The Art of Space Travel and Margot and Rosalind, and 1.5 stars to 6 Months, 3 Days. How did that win a Hugo? Then I finished the very long audiobook that I've been working on since like February, which was Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now. I read this because it was one of the books that was going to be discussed on the now sadly defunct not so hypothetical Victorian literature course run by Katie from Books and Things. So if you want more of like an in-depth analysis sort of thing, I would go check out her video where she discusses it alongside Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. So I liked this quite a bit. It is a giant sprawling Victorian novel. We're set in the 1870s. Again, I hung out in the mid-19th century a lot this month. Mostly in London, but a little bit in the countryside. We follow several families. I think the most important one, the one that we start with and we close with, are the Carburys. Lady Carbury is fairly impoverished and has started writing not very good books that she tries to get published. A meaningful portion of this poverty is caused by her son Felix, who likes to gamble, and buy horses that he can't afford, and all of those sorts of awful things. And her daughter Hedda, who refuses to marry her rich cousin, who she likes but is not in love with. She's in love with somebody else. And Mrs. Carbury spends most of her time trying to get her children married, Hedda to her cousin Roger, and Sir Felix to a new super heiress who has recently come into London from God knows where. This heiress is Marie Melmotte, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Melmotte, who have just sort of shown up. No one's quite sure where from. Germany? France? Maybe they're even Jewish. And are causing quite a stir, because no one is quite sure whether they are fashionable or not. Everyone wants to go hang out at their house because all of the people are going and hanging out at their house, but no one wants to do it individually, which is bad news for one of the important characters of the third family who's important to the plot, and that is the Longstaffs. Georgiana Longstaff, she and her brother actually have quite an interesting relationship with their parents. I really enjoyed the Longstaff scenes because they just sort of sit around and fight. So Mr. and Mrs. Longstaff, their children are all in their 20s and 30s, so fairly grown up, but all of them are still relatively living at home. And the parents seem to still think that they have the same sort of control over their children that they had when they were small, but the children are like, no, we're grown-ups now. We can kind of do what we want. Georgiana wants her father to open up their house in London so that she doesn't have to stay in the countryside all season because she needs to hang around men if she's ever going to get married. Her father refuses, and she says, well, I will just go hang out with the Melmottes, and kind of shoots herself in the foot there. Dolly Longstaff, there's a house that sort of he owns and sort of his father owns, and they decide to sell it to the Melmottes because they, like most of the upper class people in this story, except for the Melmottes, are broke. But Dolly will only consent to the sale if his father agrees that £20,000 from the sale will not go to Papa, but will instead go to Dolly so that he can pay off some debts that he has. And when I explain all these business transactions, they're boring, but they're much more interesting in the book. I have never been so interested by financial transactions than I was in The Way We Live Now. So the Carburys, the Melmottes, and the Longstaffs are the sort of focal point for the story, and then branching off of that you get a whole system of side characters. And for most of this book, I liked it a lot, and I thought I was going to end up giving it 5 stars. However, the last couple of chapters knocked it down to like a 4.25 probably. So as we're wrapping up and getting to the natural ending point of the story, it looks like we're going to have, by my count, 7 unmarried women, which this is a Victorian novel. We cannot have 7 unmarried women. Let's marry some of them off. And I found most of these final plot points rather unsatisfying, either because they were really drawn out and I didn't care and why did this need an entire chapter, or because they were not foreshadowed at all. One of our ladies ends up marrying this guy that we have never heard of before until the final few chapters, and I feel like he could have been like invited to a dinner, and if we just had like one sentence, I don't know, have them glance at each other and then drop it for like 40 chapters. And then when it comes back, it would be really great and satisfying. But no, because there is no setup, the payoff is just not a payoff. You should still read it though. It's very smart and I think innovative in sort of, it felt sort of cinematic in how like scene transitions occur and how the eye of the narrator moves through different parties throughout one scene. But anyway, moving on to the final thing. Oh my god, I'm almost done filming this video. I finished My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. A lot of people on BookTube have talked about this. I have talked about this before. It's by Daphne du Maurier and I love it so much. I give it 5 stars. You should read it. And now I am done.
No sooner was her answer dispatched than Mrs. Dashwood indulged herself in the pleasure of announcing to her son-in-law and his wife that she was provided with a house and should incommode them no longer than till everything were ready for her inhabiting it. They heard her with surprise. Mrs. John Dashwood said nothing, but her husband civilly hoped that she would not be settled far from Norland. She had great satisfaction in replying that she was going into Devonshire. Edward turned hastily towards her on hearing this, and in a voice of surprise and concern, which required no explanation to her, repeated,
"Devonshire? Are you indeed going there? So far from hence? And to what part of it?"
She explained the situation. It was within 4 miles northward of Exeter.
"It is but a cottage,"
she continued,
"but I hope to see many of my friends in it. A room or 2 can easily be added, and if my friends find no difficulty in travelling so far to see me, I am sure I will find none in accommodating them."
She concluded with a very kind invitation to Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood to visit her at Barton, and to Edward she gave one with still greater affection. Though her late conversation with her daughter-in-law had made her resolve on remaining at Norland no longer than was unavoidable, it had not produced the smallest effect on her in that point to which it principally tended. To separate Edward and Eleanor was as far from being her object as ever, and she wished to show Mrs. John Dashwood by this pointed invitation to her brother how totally she disregarded her disapprobation of the match. Mr. John Dashwood told his mother again and again how exceedingly sorry he was that she had taken a house at such a distance from Norland as to prevent his being of any service to her in removing her furniture. He really felt conscientiously vexed on the occasion, for the very exertion to which he had limited the performance of his promise to his father was by this arrangement rendered impracticable. The furniture was all sent around by water. It chiefly consisted of household linen, plate, china, and books, with a handsome pianoforte of Marianne's. Mrs. John Dashwood saw the packages depart with a sigh. She could not help feeling it hard that as Mrs. Dashwood's income would be so trifling in comparison with their own, she should have any handsome article of furniture.